topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Bill Martinez Show. Great to have you with us. We've got Dr. Wilfred Reilly going to be joining us. He is the author of 3 books that I know of, probably more, actually. We always talk about Taboo, 10 Facts that you can't talk about, hate crime hoax, and also his new book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, which is now ready for pre-order. And that book especially is very appropriate because of the topic. And the topic today is that parents are reclaiming their rights for their kids' sakes. Let's welcome Dr. Wilfred Reilly, the professor of political science at Kentucky State University and the author of said 3 books. Will, welcome to the show. Good to have you with us.
Great to be here, Bill. Always enjoy working with you. Good to be on the TV show.
Well, yeah, this is a maiden flight for us, so we'll try and do the best we can to behave ourselves. Okay.
Good. Am I one of the first guests?
Oh, no. You're I've been trying to get you on this for I think for almost 2 months. I think this is the first time that you were available. So but look, it's always an honor to have this time together to elevate the conversation, because at the very heart of all this is we want our audience to be all the smarter for the impartation, especially of your wisdom and expertise, and especially as it relates to education. It might be appropriate right off the bat. Your book, Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, that really kind of sets the stage for where we are in today's education. Tell our audience about this book, how they can get their hands on it, and why this was something that you had to write.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how to get the book, without false modesty, I mean, all my books have been bestsellers or close, at least for a little bit, all praise. And I mean, so you can find them pretty much everywhere. I mean, this book's available on Amazon for pre-order. The first 2 came out with Regnery, great right-leaning press. This one's coming out with HarperCollins, which is even larger on the national scale. Right. So it's pretty easy to find. I would recommend either Amazon or your local bookstore, but there are, a dozen other options, Goodreads and so on. Down the line. And this book, I mean, we'll break it down in a little more detail, I'm sure, but really just, it looks at this idea that we constantly hear that Americans are being lied to kind of from the right. Mm-hmm. Like in higher ed, there are all of these books, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, looking at, historical dishonesty about what Native Americans, Mexican Americans did in the historical USA. Lies My Teacher Told Me, which is a very left-wing book. It's written by a Marxist, and it looks at that kind of jingoistic education you might have gotten in the 60s in the heartland. And I started asking, well, okay, it's fair enough. I mean, there obviously were great Native and so on contributions and brave leaders on the other side. Sure. But for the past 50 years, I mean, people that are on kind of the American center left have controlled education, have controlled media. So are they telling the truth? Right. Why are we still hearing about Emmett Till? Right. And not to make fun of it. And so this book looks at that, like 10 big narratives. Are they real?
Yeah. Can this book balance it out a bit, Will? I mean, that would be the hope, that because like you and I've always talked about, is that we need disparate conversation and participation. This is important, for us to be able to grow in intellect and come up with some better options, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I have no problem with and I think this is true in general for the American political right and center. Like, I have no problem with people on the left talking. Now, there are things like pornography and obscenity that are often banned by law. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you can't have those things in school libraries, that kind of thing. But
you're not supposed to anyway.
Yeah, I mean, apparently there are quite a few cases. But I mean, the point, though, is like, short of that, I mean, I have no problem with good faith liberals saying they favor a different healthcare system or something. Mm-hmm. And there was a recent article, I forget the journal, but it was called Even Frenchmen Have Accomplished That. And it talked about national healthcare. And I thought that was actually funny and sort of a legitimate point from the other side. Right. So I think most of us, quote unquote, don't object to an open discourse. But the issue with that is that a lot of people on the other political side do. And so to really have a fair exchange of ideas, everyone needs to be able to exchange ideas. You can't censor the union guy or the liberal, like admittedly we used to in the 30s or 40s, but you also can't censor the large majority of the country that's making points about gender ideology or the quote unquote anti-racist movement or foreign policy that are just accurate.
Exactly.
So yeah, I'm very glad to contribute to that conversation. And I want to give Harper, Regnery is a conservative press, but I mean some credit for saying, well, we're going to publish books like this. I mean, there have been a series of these that have come out recently. I mean, I think Lauren Boebert's releasing a book, Marco Rubio. So I mean, to have a discussion, you have to have two people talking.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what the exchange of ideas is all about. And if we're going to solve the problem, we need to get all participants involved. You and I have been talking about this for ages, Will. We cannot maintain our positional stance in the silos of our lives and our echo chambers, because that doesn't serve the grander purpose. I mean, it's so frustrating. And I don't know if we just have to get so frustrated that our silos blow up, whatever. Well, thank God if that's what happens, so that we can talk about it, because regardless, if you talk to the left or to the right, they all agree it's not working. Okay. All right. Good observation. What do we need to do in order to make it work? Is that too tough a question to ask?
No, I think that's a really valid question to ask. And I think when you look at when America has worked, and I will say a lot of the things people complain about today, like immigration, now we need to stop illegal immigration totally. Yeah. But I mean, the wave of migration into the USA from, Ireland, Southern Italy, if you want to parallel today's Hispanic migration, the Black West Indies, so on. I mean, that's been much greater at different times in the past. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the boogeymen that people trot out in terms of why the country is not working as it used to don't actually work that well. I think that the answer is pretty simple. The causes are complex, but people are refusing to interact in an adult way and sort of just do their jobs. Mm-hmm. And a lot of things thus become very impractical. Like the U.S. government has been funded by what are called omnibus packages for something like the past decade.
Exactly.
Because Congress can't agree to just pass individual budgets. Like the Republicans and the Democrats can't sit down and say, okay, if you take some of these dubious books out of education and you stop putting some of these requirements on students, we would be willing to increase funding slightly in these states. You can't have that conversation. So you just put together a giant package where everything is budgeted at the same level as the year before, plus an inflation figure. Mm-hmm. And that's how the government keeps running. And of course, that's not ideal. I guess what I'm saying here is everyone does agree things don't work. In the past, when you've had leaders, Reagan and Tip O'Neill even, but certainly going back before that to Roosevelt and Eisenhower, mm-hmm. people have had to sit down, look at a real problem, and decide to solve it. You don't exploit the problem for clicks online. You actually think about what the solutions are. And for a lot of problems like crime, they're very simple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and this has been the problem of politics and why people hate politics, because politics is not uniting us. And unfortunately, as they say, politics is downstream the culture. So it really speaks of the cultural animus and disunity that we have right now, and the dysfunction. And it's almost because the culture is so dysfunctional. It's almost as if, that politics has kind of supplanted, the culture. And instead of politics being downstream culture, it's like, the culture is downstream politics.
Yeah, I think that, it's not so much that politics has supplanted culture. It's that a lot of the things that used to traditionally give America culture have vanished. Uh-huh. And so there are really 2 points here. Like first, in terms of things like religious identification. Are you a Catholic? Are you a Baptist? Do you go to services once a week? I mean, that's declined by something like 50%.
Yes.
And I think we both think that's a very big one, but that's combined with a lot of other things. Like we no longer have a partly drafty army. So not every guy does their 2 to 4 years in the military, where you have to meet people from around the country and get along with them and probably fight with them against a fairly tough opponent. Much lower number of people play varsity sports. There's a whole book called Bowling Alone that breaks down all of this, especially for men.
I love that. Bowling Alone. What a great book.
Yeah, it's a great title, but I mean, like
Yeah,
the old bowling leagues where I mean, your wife would probably be cooking real meals 4 or 5 days a
exactly.
week, and she'd want you out of the house.
Yeah.
So you and the boys would, you'd have a couple beers, and you'd go take a cigar, and you'd go down to the Union Hall or whatever, and you'd bowl, or
Mhm.
you'd plan a trip for the family, or you'd go fishing or something. Those were organized groups, and
Exactly.
that's really declined. So like
Mhm.
the one of the points they make in that book, Bowling Alone, is that there are almost as many bowling alleys today, but the people that go there are either single, practicing their competitive game, or they're going on like first time hookup dates.
Yeah.
You don't have families, you don't have leagues. So that kind of thing, the reason people care so much about politics in America, I think, is that a lot of people, and I think this is especially true on the left, when you look at religious services or family size, don't have anything else to identify with. You see the same thing with pets, by the way,
Mhm.
where people are walking around with like Rottweiler puppies and baby carriages with parasol hats on their head and all that. I mean, it's funny, but it's like
Yeah.
there's a sadness underlying that. Like,
Yeah, it's quite the commentary, no doubt about it. Yeah, you're exactly right.
yeah, but I mean, the person doing that is almost invariably a young businesswoman that purchased an expensive baby carriage, probably thought a
Mm.
relationship was going to work out. It didn't. You got the carriage, and now you got a dog in it. And it's funny, and I love dogs. I mean,
Yeah.
but like that is not where you want to be as a society. And that has generational impact. So, like, one of the undiscussed facts in our society is these sort of crazy senior ghettos. Like,
Mhm.
there's plenty of nice retirement facilities as well. But I mean, like, if you're on kind of the public dime or close to it, I mean, you're going to be going to a pretty bad place if you don't
Oh,
have
yeah.
kids to help you out down the road. And that's just kind of an undiscussed fear of a ton of people. Like,
Yeah.
I've had older relatives ask, is that going to happen in our family? The answer is, of course not.
Yeah.
But that kind of thing that becomes cyclical when you don't
Mhm.
have those other identifiers. So I think a lot of the people pushing dogs in baby carriages, not necessarily religious, not necessarily in a relationship that's going to lead to marriage. I don't want to stereotype too much here, but at least on one side, those seem to be the people that are very, very frenzied about Tennessee abortion policy or something like that.
Yeah.
So to rebuild politics, you may first have to rebuild culture.
No doubt. And at the very base, like you touched on this, it has to do with the moral fiber. We have become unhinged and disanchored from these moral principles that are the basis of our Constitution. It's the basis of our civility, the strength of our family, our communities, and I believe because of the degradation of morality in our societies today, this is the manifestation of the America that we're seeing right now. And hopefully we get to that point, Will, where, I often tell the kids experience defines preference. Well, how much more experience and pain do you have to go through to realize that's not working? And we're smarter than this.
Yeah, I think morality is an interesting conversation because I mean, in all honesty, I'm not an amoral person, but I come from the business world. There's some very successful predatory people, and there have been some very successful hunter societies like Rome,
Mhm.
but that's not the model that America was established on. I think the American ideal was very much that for the constitutional guarantees to work out, citizens would have to like one another to a certain extent and expect honorable behavior from one another, would
Exactly.
have to view one another as countrymen.
Yeah, you
I would
don't you
say,
don't you don't go out and get into a duel and shoot each other. Okay, just saying.
well, I mean, we allowed that for 100 years. Actually,
I know, I understand that, but I'm just saying, look at that's why we're progressing to a more perfect union. We go from glory to glory, and hopefully we're better. We're better now than we were 20 years ago.
I'm not sure I view killing other adult male warriors consensually as all that evil, but we often have some interesting ranging conversations on the radio show, Bill. I mean,
Oh,
but
why
no,
not?
but this basic point of so I guess my point here would be I think there are a number of philosophies that can work as guides for people. Stoicism worked for the Romans,
Mm,
Buddhism works well enough for the Asians. The West, of course, has always been Christianity combined with Athenian liberalism. And I think that of all the alternatives that work, that one historically has probably worked the best. But this is really more of a philosophical debate than a relevant one, because if you do have any core philosophy, like Japan would become a worse country if everyone started abandoning Buddhism for some reason in
mhm.
favor of, promiscuous sex and dual style violence and so on. And that's the equivalent of what we're seeing to some extent in the USA. So we've seen in the USA over a fairly short period of time, We've seen many of the social, I guess this gets into where I get active in politics. I think there's a very specific movement, which is kind of downstream from communism. And I don't think it's a conspiracy theory.
Right.
I think all of the various postmodern ideas are focused on essentially attacking Western and to some extent human society as evil. So, I mean, the idea is that almost everything that we identify with and value in the United States, that would include the church, certainly.
Right.
It would include democratic government in our form. The claim is that minorities aren't truly allowed to speak and other things like this. It would include the family, which is the male ownership of women or whatever the fourth wave feminist claim is, so on. All these things are bad. So this isn't happening coincidentally. Like, you've seen a concerted attack on them.
Yes, exactly.
So things that were alternatives to the older model, like prostitution, quote unquote, sex work, are very often glorified by people that want to destroy the older model. And I guess my approach would be, we can flex the older model a little bit. I don't think you should be unmarriageable if you've had 2 premarital partners or something like that. But the core idea kind of has to stay for the old institutions of the society to stay.
Right.
You could argue we could change the institutions and move forward, but I frankly don't trust the people that are currently in charge to do that. I don't think that a constitution written by, say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to pick some very low-hanging fruit, would be on par with one written by Thomas Jefferson.
Well, and because it wasn't just written by Thomas Jefferson. He had a lot of input, no doubt about it, but there were a lot of people participating. Again, you know, like you and I have been talking about, it's coming together, bringing your disparate thoughts, you know, to a solution. And to me, that's the beauty of this Constitution and why it has lasted 247 plus years, which, oh yeah, by the way, on Sunday is U.S. Constitution Day. And I remind our viewers, that might be a good excuse to, you know, reintroduce yourself to the Constitution. And just, I mean, every time, Will, I got to tell you, every time I read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, I am in awe. I'm in awe of its simplistic brilliance. And hear how, you know, the fact that it's withstood this many years and the attacks, you know, from those on the left, neo-Marxists coming in that, you know, supposedly have a better idea. And I say supposedly because so much of what they have to offer is a theory. And when you go back and revisit their theories historically, it comes with a lot of human carnage. I don't want that for my kids or my grandkids.
One of the things about the U.S. Constitution that's actually worth noting is that it doesn't attempt to create a perfect society. The founding fathers like James Madison were fond of saying things like, if men were angels, there would be no need for government, but alas, we are not. So the Constitution is full of all these compromises. I mean, so the great compromise in the Constitution is that the House of Representatives is based on population. Exactly. Every person gets a vote, or every man, I suppose, which was at the time unheard of. You still had kings and emperors around the world. However, the Senate represents states. So each state gets 2 senators regardless of size. And I mean, this just goes on and on and on throughout the document. Even the things that are criticized, like the 3/5 compromise, the claim often is, you know, blacks were treated as 3/5 of a human being.
Right.
First, that wasn't African Americans, that was slaves, but also that was the anti-slavery position. Slave masters wanted slaves to count as one full person, although slaves couldn't vote because that would have given the South permanent near majority representation, at least in Congress.
Right.
And so there was this very eloquent deal made to prevent that, to make it possible for the northern states to down the road, and it wasn't all that long down the road, 1808, that the slave trade was banned, defeat slavery. So you have this very real document that's adjusting to the real issues of the time. What do we do about indentured servants? I mean, we all forget that the whites that were nearly enslaved, Native Americans, were also mentioned in the 3/5 compromise. And after an awkward day-long wrangle, they were counted as humans. So, I mean, you had to decide all these real issues in reality. Natives, of course, only were if they were living in towns and paying taxes, which I think is really funny when you get down to the core mission of government. Right. But just the communism tries to create this fake perfection on earth, whereas the real successful document, the Constitution, the Magna Carta, take into account reality at the time. You know, in England at this time, we do have barons, we do have guildsmen. Now, what rights can a semi-free yeoman, a guildsman or a minor baron, invoke against the king? You don't propose killing the king and destroying the entire system. You improve it from the inside.
Exactly. Well, we're talking with Dr. Wilfred Reilly. He is the professor of political science at Kentucky State University and author of Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. It's a book that's coming out soon. When is the release date on that book, Will?
Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me. The date is still listed online as early next spring, February. My understanding is we're going to move that up to December so that we can beat the Christmas rush.
Exactly. Get them in those stocking stuffers. We'll get them in there. Make sure you've got plenty of intellectual offerings there at Christmas. Besides grandma's fruit bread, or whatever they call it. I forget what they call it. Fruitcake. What is it about fruitcake? And people, it's so funny, Will, they'll say, well, you haven't had my fruit. It doesn't matter. It tastes like fruitcake. It's like liver. Oh, you just haven't had my way that I cook liver. No, it still tastes like liver. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the fruitcake actually is a pretty tasty thing. If you go to, buddies have told me this in Austria or in some of the Central American countries where they make it with like real candied fruits that have been sitting in the sugar for a day. But in America, they have to endure for 6 months, right? They make them in July. So you've got all kind of crap, I'm sure, that's shot in there. You've got basically gummy bears in the cake. Yeah, they're not delicious.
Well, I think what happens between me and you, they go back and they get last year's supply that was left over and they just recycle it, And I guess so. If you have some relative that you don't really want to say Merry Christmas to, you send them, fruitcake in the mail. I don't know. But
it's probably something like that. Like there's the famous old Seinfeld episode about re-gifting where they keep giving each other this junk over years. It's like a good golf driver. Actually, if you're a guy, you recognize some of these presents, like a golf driver, like a book on the Civil War, like a fruitcake. Right. The fruitcakes from 1972. So I wouldn't be surprised by that if you tried to actually cut into one of these bad boys because you went to the gym for a weight day, knife breaks. But so it's not the best of the Christmas foods for sure.
No, not at all. Well, that's like what you remember $2 Chuck?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right. When it first came out, it was like, okay, this was a heck of a deal for $2, man. You got some wine there, and I would say by experience, the Cabernet Sauvignon, you had to go through about 4 or 5 bottles, and you might get lucky and get one that tastes halfway decent. But that was my experience anyway. But then the word got out. It was $2 Chuck. So then you couldn't bring it to parties anymore because how cheap are you? You're bringing in a $2 bottle of wine, you might as well bring in, a box of wine, right?
40 ounce or something like that. The funny thing about that though, is that you're right. You had to go through 2 or 3 bottles to get to a bottle that had properly settled and so on. But that's still $6. Yeah, if you're decanting those for like a drinking date with a partner or something. So like a bottle of wine, $20-$30, like $2 Chuck was a pretty good investment. Yeah. If you were, and this is like fraternity guys I knew, and so I had to do this, but like you could just pour into a bottle of expensive wine. I wouldn't know the difference. Right. There's this guy who he's a British TV host who makes fun of a lot of the pretensions of French and for that matter, American culture. Right. And he went to the latest World Wine Cup with all the like big Parisian and California and Italian growers. And he basically did that. He took like one of the better Paul Rossi bottles. It isn't bad. It's like $18. But he poured it into a bottle of wine that he had made by a glassblower friend and called it like Le Cavalier de Coq or something like that. And entered it in the show. And it finished like 3rd. This is on Twitter right now. Like people are saying like good earthy notes, seems like it was made by one of the better Italian winemakers and so on down the line. So I personally think like most people drink because they like to be a bit buzzed at parties. Yeah. This is especially true for a lot of young men and a lot of my female friends. Mm-hmm. Like people put ice cubes in wine, underage, whatever. I don't think most people could tell the difference between $1,000 bottle of wine and $2 Chuck, in all honesty.
Well, you're exactly right. I remember when I was in LA radio, this is years ago, Will, they had a hoi polloi wine tasting contest, right? They had all these top, connoisseurs there, and they were at the table, and probably a dozen of them, and blindfold test. And at the end of the day, what they ended up selecting was a gold Chablis, the cheapest wine on the table. And I don't know if you remember that gold Chablis that was out, but
I know it is.
Yeah, so it was hysterical, after I'll tell you, they kind of changed the subject really quick after that ceremony.
Yeah, no, I think most things are like that. I mean, I was talking to my students the other day, and it's a historically black college. It's also a state college, so a lot of like upper middle class African American and Appalachian kids. And I mean, we were talking about this stuff like what's the best brand of car, and people were saying things like, you know, this line of Mercedes, what's the best alcohol, Belvedere. And I mean, I made the point that we think this stuff is expensive because it comes from countries that we have high tariffs on, like France and Russia, Germany. I mean, like, you know, in much of Europe, like the baseline Mercedes they were talking about is just a car.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, Amazon cars are Mercedes mid-sized vans. So the whole idea of luxury consumer spending, like bottle service in the club, you're paying $200 for a $35 bottle of liquor is pretty silly. And that's how I've always thought about it. Like your preference in wine is basically based on whether it's more sweet or more sour. I'm sure there's a more polite way to say that, but guys tend to prefer a drier, more sour tasting wine. And so you're just going to pick something that fits that bill. And most people aren't wine connoisseurs. They have no idea what year they're drinking and so on.
Exactly.
So,
well, you know, for me, and I guess I was taught early, and I've always appreciated this way when it comes to wine, you pair it up. And there's certain wines when you pair them up with a good steak, that's heaven. You know, then it starts to make sense. But, you know, sometimes you know, and then you go into a little bit lighter wine. If it's just a social, you just want to have a, you know, social glass of wine in your cup and you're having, you know, some hors d'oeuvres. That's a different type of wine. I have a tendency to lean more toward red than white. So, you know, I pick accordingly, but yeah, to me, it's how the taste complements and how it brings out the flavors of the entree.
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there are uses for wine. I mean, like good wine makes a good dinner great, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I also think that there are a pretty high percentage of people who are probably functional alcoholics that are involved in like the bourbon trailing in Kentucky or the wine scene out in California. Like, let's go to another winery this weekend. You know, and I'm not sure. I personally think you could pour gasoline in cups for some of those people and they'd be fine with it. You know, like I don't really know how many of them would require like a 17-ounce porterhouse to enjoy that day out.
No, probably not. Just give them a baguette and some cheese and a glass of kerosene.
Multiple glasses of wine.
I'll be happy. Without a doubt. Our conversation with Dr. Wilfred Reilly, professor of political science at Kentucky State University, continues here. Will, I want to talk about the state of our education. I mean, parents are really frustrated. And if the Department of Education, in my humble opinion, doesn't get their act together, you know, parents are going to really insist on some major reform because of, you know, what's going on. And at the top of all this is this idea that education somehow has preeminence over the parents when it comes to their kids.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are two dimensions here. One is the introduction of inappropriate material into the curriculum. And I mean, I think the parents are mostly correct about this. No, I mean, there are things like the large majority of Americans think there is a place for standard sex education. Like this is consent. These are the parts. These are the diseases in senior high school. I mean, so that's probably something where most Democrats and most Republicans would actually agree. Right. You know, I mean, you have the marriage manual book from high school with the line drawings in it to avoid the pornography laws and all this. And I mean, like the average boy would probably find that useful. Like, of course, you can opt your kid out, so on. But I don't think most people have a huge problem with that. But you have stuff that goes well beyond that. I mean, from classic gay literature, like All Boys Aren't Blue in the schools, to, and I mean, there's a hilarious scene where I think it's Joe King from Louisiana just read some of the gay sex scenes from that.
Wow. You see the response? Oh my God. Yeah, exactly.
Well, it was very funny. I mean, he was a guy in a $1,000 Brooks Brothers suit, witty old guy. I mean, he's sitting there like, this is my butt. I mean, I don't want to, I'm not going to read anything explicit for an audience like this one, but it was one of the most hilarious things I've ever seen. It was on par with the Saturday Night Live skit, given that everyone there was an adult.
And you thought, and you almost thought, okay, I just stepped into an SNL skit. But this is real life. I mean, this is what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, like, I like booty, he told me. I mean, like, is that really something you need in the 8th grade library? I mean, probably not. So there's that on the one hand. And by the way, it goes well beyond, like, debatable books. So, I mean, to me, much more dangerous is the sort of gender indoctrination curriculum.
Exactly.
Where people are told that in addition to sex, so I'll be very blunt about this. I think gender is a complete woo idea.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the sense of like the craziest homeopathic medicine, somebody with a degree in a non-technical field kind of made it up. It's a guy named John Money. Another feminist academic, Judith Butler.
Appropriately named John Money. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, not only did he earn a fair amount of his namesake from this stuff, but John Money also was a lunatic. I mean, he was a pedophile in the technical sense of the word. John Money was someone who believed that child sexuality begins very early on in life and it should be encouraged by responsible adults. And a lot of that's crept into what's called pleasure-based sex education, which is the idea that you should basically teach kids how to be good in bed. Again, I think you should have, the marriage manual available in the adult section of the library. You can figure it out with your girlfriend at past age, whatever. But I think I would be very suspicious of any teacher that had a strong interest in improving children's sexual skills. So all of this is stuff that's really gotten into the schools over decades. But gender in general, of course, for those in the audience that are a little confused about what might seem like a nonsense concept, is the idea that the stereotypes associated with sex create a secondary identity that's as important as sex. So if I am me, I'm a 200-pound, fat but strong, biological male, a suit, and I say, well, as it happens, I prefer male lovers. I do not. But, I prefer certain dishes. I like the color pink over the color blue. I'm a woman inside. That's what your gender ideology is. It's this internal sense that comes from these norms and stereotypes. Then I should be treated as a woman. This is a very novel idea that has a lot of implications. The questions are, of course, like, should quote unquote male women go to women's prison, play sport against women in competitive leagues, so on down the line. Should lesbians be expected to date these people and engage in normal, intimate couples practices with them, let's say? And I think most people looking at this would say, well, that's absolutely nonsensically absurd. This is just a man that thinks he's a girl.
Yeah, right.
Like, I mean, we used to call this transsexualism. We used to call this cross-dressing. But the idea that this is something very different and legitimate is being taught to kids at a very early age now, and that is impacting them. So like 21% of young people now say they're in the LGBT community, but that doesn't mean they have a lesbian girlfriend or something.
Yes, right, exactly.
Yeah, it means that they have had enough promiscuous hookups that they describe themselves as bisexual. There may have been people of both sexes there. It means that they identify as queer, which is kind of a meaningless term. But most especially, it means that they would put themselves in this trans or non-binary category. Like, I feel like a boy sometimes in this stereotypical sense, so I can't be a girl. I'm ambigender. That's what people are talking about. They're not saying they're gay. They're saying they are non-binary or demisexual or something like that. So I think that's the problem in the schools. That's one. The other problem is just we're not teaching kids to read.
I was going to say, what about the basics? Exactly. I mean, if you're so concerned about sex and you're focusing their attention on that, what about reading, writing, arithmetic, the basic objective and mission of education, right?
Well, there's a famous meme on the internet where a kid raises his hands and is like, what's 26 times 34? And the teacher, who's this hip-looking African-American guy, comes over and is like, I said we gay today. And like hands him a book on, whatever the topic is. So like, yes, of course. Like if you make sex education used to be 2 weeks. That was genuinely useful if you're in a relationship, but awkward with an old priest talking to you. They might have a banana. A lot would be devoted to various diseases you can catch. And that probably has a place. It can be debated at the local level by parents, I think, is the answer there.
Well, I think in some cases, we'll just interrupt you just a second. In some cases, girls that were, heading fifth and sixth grade, sadly, their parents wouldn't even talk to them, didn't even, prepare them for their first period. Yes. And so then, somehow the onus, and it shouldn't have been an onus that fell on the educators, but the educators picked up on it because, the school doctors or the school nurses, all of a sudden, fifth and sixth graders are coming in, for treatment. They have no idea. And these girls just don't even understand, the elements of what's happening with their body. And so then, the Department of Education says, okay, well, the parents obviously are not facilitating their daughters. So then, they took it by default.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a little awkward. One, as a male, and two, as a conservative guy, to really talk about this issue in depth. Like, I mean, sex ed in the schools isn't something I write a lot about. But yes, of course, like the basic idea that there should be an introductory 6-week semi course called something like Human Body, where you talk about the fact that you're not dying if you have your period.
Right.
Girls, at least, should probably be aware of what a clitoris is. You know, like boys should be very aware of what consent is. Like your girlfriend can say no if she's uncomfortable with this in high school for X number of dates, or even through the period of, secondary education. So all that, like, sure. What we're talking about, though, is just at a basic level, if you devote a year to sex and gender education, you're not devoting that same amount of time to something more useful.
Exactly.
So it doesn't take all that long to figure out what a penis is to some extent. Well, these days it sometimes seems to. But, sex is in reality, when you remove the gender woo, not very complicated. The second point with the schools, though, that we're kind of getting into with this is that the schools aren't doing all that well. Ian Rowe, who's a pretty well-known educator by this point, friend of mine, and the head of Vertex Academy in New York.
Mm-hmm.
A point that he makes is we often try to break this down in racial terms. How would the U.S. schools look if they only had a European student population? They were majority upper middle class white. Mm-hmm. And Rowe actually broke this down for a published paper and says, well, they'd still look pretty bad. As of the past 10 years, we've never seen a year where 50% of kids in any racial category, Asians sometimes get here for math, but if tested as even proficient in reading. Mm-hmm. So you have, and I checked out his numbers and he's right. So, I mean, you have basic, or I guess you have below basic, failing. Then you have basic. Then you have proficient, which is average or above. Then you have advanced, which is where you want the kids to go. And I guess gifted would be above advanced. Mm-hmm. And as of right now, more than 50% of every ethnic population is below proficient.
Yes.
So you've got to figure out what to do to raise that. It's not really that complicated. I mean, you need smart teachers without all the union protections for the worst teachers. You need longer hours in school, which would help out working parents a great deal. You need to pay teachers a little more, but only if they perform, so on down the line. Like, we know what they do in Japan. We know what they do in actually very integrated countries like Brazil in the upper income cities. We know what they do in Norway. We just don't do it. So the question is, will we start doing it?
Mm-hmm. Well, and you bring up an excellent point. See, this has been my problem from day one. I mean, look I've worked in unions before, and I resisted them by experience, because my takeaway in being associated with unions is it promoted mediocrity. And I just saw this, in my broadcasting career, and in so much of other things, particularly in schools, because they are so controlled by the unions. We're not promoting excellence, and we're getting mediocre results. And for all the money that we're investing in this, my goodness, I mean, I appreciate the movement by legislators, our representatives, saying, hey, look, at the money for education should go with the child. So if it's a charter school or a private school, you have situations where, even elected officials whose children could be going to public schools, but no, they're making the money, they can afford it, so they send them to private schools. Why do you send them to private schools? Because they get better education, theoretically.
Yeah, I mean, Corey DeAngelis online, who's a school choice advocate, has developed an argumentative strategy where every time anyone criticizes him for trying to destroy public education, he'll just look up where they sent their kid to school.
Right.
And 95% of the time, he'll just reply, you sent your kid to private school, or you sent your kid to the one charter school in your town. So, yeah, the public schools aren't working.
Right.
And it's a complex question. It's actually not a complex question of why. The public schools are a government near monopoly. They don't really have any competition. They're going to get money no matter what they do. So they've proven to be a very receptive kind of contact point for all these crazy theories that come out of academia and the schools of education. Mm-hmm. So woke is really more prevalent in school than anywhere else. I mean, that's basically like their entire social media accounts and online broadcast channels like Libs of TikTok that are basically just devoted to calling out teachers and people in 1 to 2 other professions who are, filling up the entire classroom experience with the Black Lives Matter signs and various LGBT propaganda and so on down the line. And I think that's kind of easier to do there. like to get a school to buy DEI, SEL, CRT,
Exactly.
New Age.
Well, and especially if you got a captured audience, if you're like Governor Newsom in California and your wife is she's a producer of said material. So you set up a deal and funnel money in her direction to produce these these curriculum pieces that now are being distributed. I guess their next goal is they're distributing them across the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly hard to avoid. Now, I mean, the right also has impacts on the school system, just because when a state doesn't adopt, for example, a textbook, and it's a large state, the textbook generally fails on a national scale. So, I mean, 10 or 12 years ago, there were national debates because states like Texas wanted to include, for example, intelligent design theories in the science textbooks and said, well, if those aren't included for at least a page or two, we're not going to buy the textbook. Right. So, but I mean, this doesn't really counter what we're saying. The idea that the right can do this too and screw with the schools isn't a plus. So the basic idea is that because this is a public service and it's a captured public service, anyone who wants to sell into that has a connection to people in power can do so pretty easily.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. And Thomas Sowell wrote a book in, I think, 2020 talking about this, charter schools and their enemies, where at one point, I noticed this because I'm what's called a culturalist on IQ. There are test score differences between groups. And I don't think that most of them, like the difference between Caucasian, Hispanics, and other whites, are plausibly due to either genetics or racism. Like, it doesn't make sense. I think that there are basic cultural things, like the amount of time people in each group study for school, that predict like 90% of this. Yeah. But this book, and I think most people would, at a commonsensical level, agree with that. Right. In kind of a 10,000 hours sense. Like, the more you study for a tough class, the better you'll probably do in that class. Exactly. The more you practice your jump shot, the better you'll be at basketball. But the one line from the book is that students who went to good charter schools that were free of all this poison of the school system, we've broken down a lot of it, the dumb union teachers, bluntly, the ideological indoctrination, the crazy companies selling all these prep guides, all this. Students who just went to school and learned to read and read the Iliad. Right. If you looked at the same population of kids, like people that applied to get into the charter school but were rejected for whatever reason, versus people who applied and got in, it's just random selection. The people who applied and got in years down the road scored about 200 points higher on the SAT. So, like, we know there's an alternative model that works pretty well. The question is, how do you get through all the free riders and debt loaders and so on that are exploiting the current model?
Exactly. And mediocratizing the process. It was interesting to your point. I don't know if you saw this graph or not. I think it was just released last week, where it took the demographics and by race, the amount of time that kids were, dedicating to their education.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if you saw, but I mean, Asians were off the charts. I mean, because of the, to your point, how much time and dedication. I mean, Kobe Bryant, that was his mentality. He said, look, I know I'm willing to put in 3-4 hours a day to be the best basketball player ever. And look at him. Look what happened. I mean, the results, were quite obvious because of the effort that he put in to his game. And we're forgetting that part of the conversation that is so critical. And here we want to, malign Asian kids because they perform so well in the education process. But look at they've earned it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an almost total meritocrat. I think that in each field, the people that do the best should be the people we reward. Yes. And that's the best thing for society overall. I mean, no one wants to watch an NBA basketball game that's a bunch of 5'6" guys, equally divided by race, trudging up and down the court, bricking mid-range jump shots. I mean, no, you want to watch a bunch of speedy brothers and Russians dunking the ball. And I mean, because those are the groups that currently, there may be a slight genetic factor there. Right. But I mean, those are the groups also that currently play the most basketball. Basketball is the national sport of Yugoslavia, which is where Slovenia, Bosnia, Macedonia, all those countries that produce those warrior-looking guys in the league are. They're located in the center of that former heartland. So, I mean, same thing for Asians in reverse. Obviously, we shouldn't penalize it. But the graphic that Bill's referring to, for anyone listening, is from a 2017 Brookings Institute study that tried to figure out why people actually do well in school. And they looked at the racism explanation, and in the gingerly way that liberals do, they touched on genetics for 3.2 seconds. And then they actually just asked kids how much they studied and then confirmed that with their parents.
Right.
And Asian American kids study twice as much as whites and 3 times as much as blacks, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's it. Like, we don't need any wild theories. The only claim is that there might be an impact of racism or genes on that. But, like, we know that if any group of reasonably intelligent people, Irishmen or Jamaicans, were to study that much, they do about as well. They just don't.
Exactly. Well, and plus all the scientific, follow the science, the science study of the human brain and how elastic it is and what it's able to produce. I mean, you've got kids, Will, we've heard the stories. We've seen the evidence of kids that should not be performing, like Dr. Carson, for example. This guy's being raised by a single mom with a third grade education level. And he and his brother go on and do incredible things. I mean, and this is just one of many stories like this in the naked cities of America.
Yeah, I mean, there probably is an element of natural genius to some extent. Like, for example, I was a pretty good basketball player, and as I recall, you're a pretty good athlete. But I mean, like, listening to talking about Kobe Bryant, like Kobe Bryant's also 6'7".
Yeah.
Like, he looks small on the court because he's standing next to Shaq.
Yes.
So Pau Gasol from Spain, like the mountain highlands of Spain. Right. So I mean, like that also helps. Like, yeah. I mean, I've seen guys who have the same handle that Kobe Bryant does that played high school varsity ball because they were 6'1". Right. So I mean, like, so there's also that. But given that you're reasonably fit and you're not an inhuman height, you're 6'6", like, what's going to determine whether you make it to the league as opposed to a D2 basketball team is your amount of practice. It's your amount of hours on the court. And yeah, Kobe was famous for having what he called the Mamba mentality, where he'd go out for 4 hours a day, he'd practice, he'd play with weights around his ankles. And in America right now, it's the East Asian kids and the Indian kids that are playing with weights around their ankles academically, that are going home to a tutor.
Exactly right. Yeah, Tiger Woods, how many golf balls do you think he hit every day?
I mean, 1,000. Tiger Woods is like, there's a story about Tiger Woods talking to his dad, Earl, who was an Army master sergeant and also a pretty good amateur golfer.
Right.
And Earl Woods said he used to hit golf balls until his hands cracked a little bit. You had calluses and a little bit of blood. And that might be a slight father's exaggeration, but I mean, you can do that. Yeah. And so Tiger Woods went out and hit 500 golf balls, and he came home and he's like, my hands are sore, but they're not bleeding. How long before they bleed? And Earl Woods just looked up from a dinner steak and said, a lot longer. I mean, that's what true hustle is. Like, I mean, you have the best people in the world. The best people in the world at running are Kenyans, who again might have a slight physical advantage, but who also run 50 miles a day.
But see, in Kenya, all the hills they're all downhill though, Will. So they get an advantage. I'm just kidding. You know that.
I mean, I think the real advantage, if you were making like friendly jokes about different nations, is they don't have cars or bicycles. I mean, I think they'll be significantly worse at running in 50 years. That's coming upper middle income countries. So I mean, if you got guys driving around in Yugos and so on, you're not going to have as many marathoners. But
but if it's not an electric vehicle, we may be running anyway. We're all going Amish pretty soon. So with all these manifestos that President Biden and the Greenies want, to have, for all of us to be at net zero by 2050, and there's no projection of an infrastructure to produce said results. But we're going to head that way anyway.
I think that that's the goal of a lot of this stuff, actually, like massive social change that's not necessary. So, I mean, I still keep in pretty good contact with academics in different fields. And one of the things that recently came out of the Big Ten is that there's a kind of highly refractive light gray paint that if you apply to roofs, reflects most of the sun rays that strike your home directly back up.
Right.
And there are a couple of models that estimate, and anyone interested can look this up, like light gray paint stops climate change might be a search term. But there are a bunch of models that predict that if a third of the roofs in the country were covered in this paint, maybe a little more, most of the effects of global climate change that we're seeing would just be stopped.
Yeah.
Planting trees is a similar technique. I mean, if you're worried about greenhouse gases, they're replaceable. They cycle through large, brushy, vegetative plants like trees. So I think when people say things like we need to stop driving cars because climate change is occurring, they're acting out a pre-existing war plan that was already there. Climate change is just the latest thing that they're trying to use to activate it. We heard the same things under COVID. We need to stay home, drive less, all this stuff. go to the gym on the right. Like everyone had a preset bunch of ideas that would come up in almost any scenario. Exactly. So I mean, I basically just plan on living my life and being as skeptical about this kind of stuff as I am now.
Yeah. And still, you think healthy, you do healthy, you get healthy. Why not? We got about a minute left here, Will. Again, I want to give you an opportunity to, tell everybody about your new book that, it looks like maybe December, but you can pre-order it in any way right now at all the usual places, right?
Yeah, to get Lies My Liberal Teacher Told You is what the book's called. All you have to do is go to Amazon, go to any place that sells books, and you'll find something like 10,000 pre-order copies there. I would certainly encourage people to go out and get that. And if you want to reach out to me for any reason, I mean, my name is just Wilfred Reilly. It's Reilly is the last name. And if you search that, you'll find my Facebook, Twitter, website, although that's just linked to the university. You'll find my books and so on. And I'm still at that point of like H-list celebrity where I'll come argue with you online or speak to the Rotary Club or the local veterans or whatever. So hope to be in touch.
Well, you got it. Dr. Wilfred Reilly, is always an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me on.
You got it. Our thanks to Dr. Wilfred Reilly, the professor, a political professor at Kentucky University. And thank you, for joining us today as we continue this fight to save our country and to return to God. And we need you. Okay. So may God bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you and give you peace. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a great day.